There's a very, very, very strong school of therapy that's integrated in most treatment programs that talks about stages of change, how people change. And I see some people are aware of that model. A fellow named Miller, a fellow named Prochaska, DiClemente, years ago. This is probably going back to the late 80s, but it really took off in the 90s. And it led to brief solution-focused therapy. It led to really zeroing in on how somebody, in the topic we're talking about today, how somebody goes from being oblivious to their alcoholism or addiction, where everybody else can see it, but they can't see it, to starting to really not only understand it, but accept it, internalize it, and hence stop using. And the ultimate goal, to stay stopped. We're not just talking about stopping using, because a lot of the people that we treat are able to stop. They just can't stay stopped. Some of the people never try to stop, but there are a certain segment of the population, the active alcoholic, drug-addicted population, that actually stop, and they intend to stay stopped, but they can't. Rabbi Wallerstein spoke about this. So the stages, very simply, are number one stage, the first stage, is pre-contemplation, which basically means I'm not even thinking about this. It's not on my radar screen. Even if other people are reflecting to me, you know, I think it'd be good for you to take a week off of drinking or a Shabbos off of drinking. Pre-contemplation. The next stage is contemplation. I'm starting to think about it. I am not at all thinking about anything past the possibility that I may have a problematic relationship. Remember, in the early stages, the loss is usually very abstract. In the late stages, it's very concrete, very tangible. You can see it. How do you measure loss of self-esteem? Especially when people, and particularly alcoholics and addicts, are so well-versed in transcending that addiction, in compartmentalizing the addiction, in rationalizing that addiction, in excusing it. The third stage of the changes of stage is preparation. I'm past contemplating. I'm now starting to prepare and learn what to do. Sometimes a person is very susceptible to going back and forth between contemplation and preparation. In pre-contemplation, there's not any preparation going on. It's off somebody's view. The preparation is very scary, because what the person starts to come face to face with is the idea, I'm not going to drink and drug anymore. Finally, in the action stage, a person prepares and gets certain skills. And in my estimation, part of the preparation of learning what is necessary in the action stage, leading to the action stage, is what am I going to do in terms of my loneliness, my isolation, even if I'm involved in a huge social network. Often people that are suffering from alcoholism before they've stopped using are alone, alone, alone. And the amount of people around them is irrelevant. What am I going to do when I start to have cravings? What am I going to do when I start to go through withdrawal? And I'm not just talking about physical withdrawal. I'm talking about what we called in the rehab post-acute withdrawal syndrome. What's going to happen there? How am I going to get chizuk? How am I going to get identification? How am I going to get support to make it through the day? You've all heard Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous are a day-at-a-time programs, and if a day at a time is too long, it becomes a half a day at a time, and it then becomes an hour at a time if a half a day is too long. The only way that one gets from this action phase to maintenance is by stringing together days of abstinence. And days of abstinence, of not using, are very different if they're in a recovery context versus if they're in a dry context. Being dry really means just not using. It's not growing. Recovery is about growth. Recovery is about being able to connect with people and to start to turn this around. These stages of change, what do you think about them as they relate to the concentration camp, as they relate to Viktor Frankl's model, his experience? Was there any opportunity for contemplation and pre-contemplation? This was a situation, this was a phenomenon of intense oppression. How did people get to Viktor Frankl's place? How did they get to the place that he got to? Where did that come from? Where is the spirituality developed from? Where does the meaning come from? Meaning in life, and what I'm going to suggest is another paradox, and the recovery culture is filled with paradoxes. But I'm going to suggest the first step. What the founders took from the Oxford movement, which, by the way, was a Christian movement that was totally taken from bits and pieces from the Old Testament, from Yiddishkeit, and this powerlessness over, you fill in the blank. There are a bajillion 12-step programs. They all have the same 11 steps after the first step. And the first step is the same, except for one word generally. And that word for AA is alcohol. For Narcotics Anonymous, it's narcotics. For Overeaters Anonymous, it's food. For gamblers, it's gambling.